And a very warm welcome to my viewers. Thank you for joining me today. And so what we're going to be doing today is a continuation of the lecture series on evil. Today it's lecture number 3 by Dr. Charles Mathewes. He's a professor at the University of Virginia at the time of this recording anyway. If you've followed episodes or lectures 1 and 2, this is lecture number 3 out of in a series of 36 lectures. I see no reason why we shouldn't just get into it. Okay, so I'll keep quiet for the next 30 odd minutes, and please enjoy the lecture as much as I will.
Hello again. So far, we've seen some of the ancient Near Eastern roots of thinking about evil in the West. But along with the Babylonian and Akkadian myths that we saw earlier, were the myths, tragedians, poets, and thinkers of ancient Greece, all of whom have shaped our thinking about evil, particularly through the concept of tragedy. So now, in this lecture, I want to turn to Greece. As we'll now see, a dualistic language of good and evil, such as the Babylonian myth, the Enuma Elish, presumes, is not the inevitable shape that a culture's moral imagination has to take. We know this because in Greece, an entirely different picture emerges, what you can call an anarchic polytheism, that is, belief in many gods without a single organizing moral order that the gods are all part of, dominates their moral imagination, the moral imagination of classical Greece. And it is at the basis of Greek tragedy as well. Now, here, as in the ancient Near East, there are many gods, but the gods are more like characters in a long-running drama series like Dallas or Dynasty, or choose what you will, the O.C. The struggles between them are not fundamentally inframed by a struggle between good and evil. Good and evil are terms that really seem to apply more fundamentally to humans in Greece. Instead, the Greek gods, in a certain way, exist in a weird way beyond good and evil, indulging in cruelty as easily as they take affront at it. And in neither case does it seem that their judgment or actions are beholden to any ultimately moral framework. For all their power, that is, the gods are somehow, in themselves, completely unaccountable. And because of that, at times, the Greek poets and playwrights suggest that they are, in some important way, trivial. This sort of ties together what was suggested separately in the Enuma Elish and in Gilgamesh, namely that humans suffer, but it is the gods' doings that make humans suffer. There is something divinely governed beneath the structures, often, of human tragedies, this view says. Sincere actions can lead to tragic conflicts, sometimes between goods, ends, or aims of people's action that are essentially incompatible, sorts of things that philosophers call incommensurable goods. That is, goods that you cannot have at the same time. I would love to be a professional baseball player, and I would love to be a professor. But unless I am a professor, say, of sports management, It's going to be very hard for me to dedicate my life in the right way to becoming a professional baseball player in the same time that I've got to become a professional academic. They are two life paths that you cannot pursue in the same single life. Those are incompatible paths in that way. For the Greek tragedians, there were times in life when humans had to confront choices between sets of goods, or choices, tragic conflicts we could call them, between rival sets of evils. And sometimes, out of sheer tragic providence, the fates decree that something must happen to bring the mighty down. Now, more disturbing still than the tragedian's worldview, though, is the suggestion of Thucydides, an Athenian historian and also a soldier. For whereas the tragedians suggest that evil is due to some mysterious but divinely ordained necessity, Thucydides suggests that evil may be due entirely and simply, and even more terrifyingly, to sheer luck and chance. Understanding the differences between the views of the tragedians, Sophocles and Aeschylus, and Thucydides will help us see two vividly different pictures of whence evil and suffering come in this world. Let's start with tragedy. For the Greeks, tragic drama became a crucial structure for thinking about their lives in a long-standing historical development. It took place over several centuries. In the tragedies, the Greeks reflected upon evil, fate, and luck in human affairs in plays such as Oedipus Rex and The Women of Trachis, the Bacchae. There's a series of these plays. It's important to know that when we think of a Greek tragedy, we think of going to the theater, maybe in an evening, and watching a play. These plays were not meant to be those sorts of things. They were not entertainments as we think of them. The plays were part of a yearly religious ritual in Athens, the Dionysia, honoring the god Dionysius, the god of revelry and fertility, where wine and babies come together. This festival took place over 5 days every spring, somewhat like Mardi Gras in New Orleans, but with a more serious religious tone. The Athenians used these plays as serious venues to reflect on the political, religious, and ethical situation of their community. And the plays that survive reflect that quite well. Now, it's interesting to note, tragic, you could say, to note that the plays we have are a very, very small fragment of what was written. Sophocles wrote, we know, 123 plays, but only 7 have survived to our day. It's as if all we knew of Shakespeare was a bit of Romeo and Juliet, some of the history plays, and maybe Macbeth. We heard he wrote plays with titles such as Hamlet, or King Lear, or Much Ado About Nothing, or Othello. But nothing of those plays managed to make it to our day. That's how much of the Greeks has been lost to us. Now, let's take a look at one very famous play to figure out what tragedy means in thinking about evil. Let's look at Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king, right? Perhaps one of the most popular plays for people to think about over the past 2,500 years. Now, the plot of the play is fairly complicated, but bear with me. Oedipus is king of Thebes, Jocasta his queen, and Thebes has begun to suffer from a terrible plague, a sign everyone thinks of divine wrath. Oedipus is determined to find out why the plague has been sent, And he discovers, through his investigations, that it is due to the religious pollution caused by the fact that the previous king, Laius, was murdered, but his killer never caught and punished. Oedipus then undertakes the hunt for the murderer. Through a series of inquiries, the truth emerges. It was Oedipus who killed Laius on the road to Thebes, in a dispute in which the two sides did not know one another's identities. Furthermore, and more horrifying still, Oedipus is the unknown son of Laius, the king he killed, and of Laius's queen, who is Oedipus's mother, Jocasta, who is now Oedipus's wife. Laius and Jocasta had been told by an oracle that their son would kill his father and commit incest with his mother. And so when he was born, they gave him to a shepherd to kill. But the shepherd instead took pity and gave him to a Corinthian, who raised him as his own son. Jocasta, the truth fully known at last, a truth she never knew, is so overcome by shame that she hangs herself. Oedipus blinds himself by plunging her gold hairpins into his eyes and begs for exile from Thebes. The play ends ambiguously, with the chorus chanting the famous maxim ascribed to the Greek legislator Solon, that no one should be called happy until they are dead. Now, the range of meanings, the role of fate, chance, and luck in this play speak powerfully of the terrible paradoxes of fate and responsibility that Greek tragedy was so good at communicating. One of the most traumatic things about the play is the way that Oedipus himself is the vehicle for his own self-destruction. As he himself puts it, at one point, it was Apollo, friends, Apollo, who brought this deepest bitterness, all my sorrows, to fulfillment. But the hand that struck me down was none but my own. Oedipus both recognizes his responsibility, but sees a fate as guiding things, a fate whose providential command is discernible in events, although never predictable. And so in a way, Oedipus begins to think of himself as someone who has been humbled by the gods for an arrogance he did not quite see. Sometimes, though, the plays seem to locate responsibility more directly in the gods themselves, to the point where humans seem to become angry at the gods or the cosmos for their misfortunes. At the end of Sophocles' play, The Women of Trachis, we have a remarkable moment where this happens. Now, in this play, let's not worry so much about the plot, but what happens is that a father who is about to help his son get married, Hercules, the father is Hercules, the father who's about to help his son get married is accidentally killed by the poisoning of his wife. His wife accidentally poisons him. At the end of the play, Hyllus, the son of Hercules, orders his father's acid-burned body taken off stage as his father writhes in pain, as his father is begged to be killed, to be burned alive, right? Because he has been killed by the gift from his wife. She thought she was giving him a love potion to keep him in love with her, but in fact, she was unknowingly giving him a cloak drenched in acid, which of course burned away his skin as soon as it was exposed to sunlight. And when she discovers this, she commits suicide out of horror and shame at what she's done. And as Heracles is being taken up and carried away from the stage, Hylas turns to the chorus, the female chorus, and he says to them, "Let the gods, their ruthlessness, their cruelty, be remembered. They take us to be their children and call themselves Father, and yet they well see such suffering. No one knows the future, but the present is hard. The present is shame for them, and for him who bears the victimhood, the present is pain, cruel fate. Women," he now says, speaking directly to the chorus, "come inside now. You have seen many things, terrible and strange, and there is nothing here that is not Zeus." There is nothing here that is not Zeus. Imagine a Christian or a Jew standing at the end of the Second World War and saying that everything that had happened was in some sense God's will being accomplished. That would be an enormously astonishing and, for Orthodox believers, blasphemous thing to say. But it was said in a Greek play, in a religious festival, precisely because it was a question that the Greeks were asking themselves. If we believe that the gods do govern fate, doesn't that make them in some sense responsible? What should we think about that? It's a troubling idea, but it's not incoherent, and it plays a powerful role in Greek tragedy and in much other Greek thinking. But it's not the only point of view. The idea that fate has many strange twists and turns and can turn strength against the strong and bring the mighty down became very pointed in the experience of the calamitous Peloponnesian War, captured in the historian Thucydides' book on that conflict, a book which, by the way, is named The Peloponnesian War. Useful, that. The basic story of the war is simple. It was a war between Athens and her allies and Sparta and her allies, and it lasted almost 30 years. It lasted from 431 to 404. Thucydides' book doesn't cover the whole war because it was written while the war was being fought, but it covers enough of it. The war was devastating. It enabled the spread of plagues, starvation, ruined the Greek world's economies, ruined a number of cities, and ended with the Spartans in charge of a kind of petty tyranny over much of Greece, supported by the Persians, who for the last 100 years, the Greeks had allied themselves together in trying to keep out of Greece. Right? So effectively, what this war between the Greeks did was destroy them all so much that the Persians finally were able to get control. It effectively ended the golden age of Greece. Imagine if the Cold War had turned hot. That's what this was like for Greece. Now, Thucydides' account, though it's incomplete, nonetheless bears all the marks of a work attempting to see in history a tragedy, though with some differences. Just as searching as any tragedy could be about the nature and significance of human wickedness, Thucydides took his own particular take on that wickedness. He writes in certain ways against a previous historian who it's important to understand something of in order to understand Thucydides, much as it's important, I suggested, to understand the Enuma Elish to fully understand what's going on in the book of Genesis. Thucydides is arguing with the Greek historian Herodotus, who was of a previous generation, and wrote actually about the Persian Wars, the wars that the Greeks managed to win to keep the Persians out. Herodotus saw history and culture as kinds of natural forces that shaped people's characters in certain ways, so that where you were from determined your historical behavior, your political forms in all sorts of ways. Herodotus thought of himself as a naturalist in a certain sense. Thucydides does not think that way. He sees people's decisions not as determined by their natural environment or their cultural context, cultural presuppositions, but importantly, pressured, shaped by the political pressures of the moment. Thucydides, and this is the important thing, believes in the accidental nature of things. He does not believe in determinism. Now, along with this, he's completely convinced that history always repeats itself, that the fundamental conditions of human interaction, the mix of motives and modes of apprehension that together make up human nature, these don't change for him. This is why, as he says at the very beginning of his book, Thucydides writes his book to offer lessons for people who will be in the same situation as he was at some point in the future. Now, what's interesting about this is that Thucydides' book, even today, is taught at the Naval Academy, at West Point, at all the senior military staff colleges, and especially at the Army War College, where they teach it to mid-level military officers. And a number of people have drawn connections between the story of an empire gained by bravery being turned into something that becomes oppressive to some people. Many military officers read this book now and they think, wow, this has lots to say to us in our world today. Thucydides may or may not be directly applicable to that, but one thing about his work that strikes me as very pertinent, and that is that when he talks about the idea of a state's motivations or a people's motivations, he identifies one important theme that remains pertinent for us today, namely, the human psyche in war is slowly deformed by the pressure of constant fear. Indeed, the war itself, he thought, is caused by misunderstanding and especially fear. After the Persian Wars, Athens grew increasingly powerful, eventually gaining hegemony over most of the rest of Greece. The Spartans feared for their own independence, and the growing tension between Athens' hegemony and Sparta's fear led eventually to the war. Once the war is started, like all wars, it takes on a life of its own, and it begins to master the combatants. Both sides expected a quick victory, but neither gets it. Both bear with the war, however, hoping it will exhaust the other side before it exhausts their own. Neither considers the moral costs of the war, the damage and deformation it will do to their souls, though Thucydides himself does. And in some ways, this is the greatest moment of his work. The classic case of this is the famous story, famous among a fairly narrow set of relatively nerdy individuals like myself, the famous story of the Melian dialogue at the end of Book 5 of the Peloponnesian War. Now, Melos was, and is, you can visit it today, a tiny island of no strategic importance in the middle of the Aegean Sea. It's a neutral in the war. A military group of Athenians come to it and meet with the leaders of Melos in private. They ask to have control of the island and for the Melians to ally themselves with Athens. Here's the Athenians' view, why this should happen. If we don't take control of your island and cities, others will see our not doing so as a sign of our weakness. Indeed, if you simply declare yourselves neutral between us and Sparta, others will say, well, the Athenians couldn't get them on their side, so they must be weaker than we thought. Therefore, we should try to resist the Athenians more. So because we don't want that, because we want to forestall that possibility, you must become our allies, though you don't really want to be, and we don't really need you to be. The Melians, facing this, see that they cannot appeal to the Athenian sense of justice. The Athenians are clearly far beyond that. So they appeal instead to setting a good example. They say to the Athenians, don't mistreat us, because after all, what goes around comes around, and if you mistreat us, so it will be done in turn to you. The Athenians reply, that's our belief too, but there's no way to avoid this fate. No number of good examples will teach humans out of this kind of deep pessimism about human behavior. The key for us, the Athenians, that is that might outweighs right. God is not fundamentally the arbiter of justice, but rather God is the patterner of power applied, a very curious phrase that Thucydides uses. God seems to be the structure of power that actually is imposed in the world. Force, they say, is its own law. And the law, famously, the Athenians say to the Melians, the law is what the strong impose and what the weak must acquiesce to. After Thucydides' report of this dialogue, he very quickly tells the story of what happened. The Melians refuse the Athenians' offer. The Athenians besiege the Melians and eventually take the city. When they do, they massacre all the men and take the women and the children off to slavery. Eventually, several years later, they replace all those people on the island with a colony of Athenians. After this event in Thucydides' story, things begin to go really bad for the Athenians, and they suffer a string of disastrous defeats and eventually lose the war. Thucydides' book doesn't record the end of the war, though he clearly foresees that a calamity is heading in Athens' way. But he does something very important. Other people who wrote about the war read the Athenians' defeat as in some sense morally deserved by what they had done during the war. Thucydides does not. In no way does he suggest that their defeat is because of their cruelty to the Melians. Rather, it is that, as they predicted, the wheel of fate and chance is turning around, and now cruelty will be done to them, not as payback, but as the inevitable chaos and randomness of life. Is evil or cruelty wholly a matter of circumstance and accident? The Athenians in civilian life would never have imagined that one day they would effectively exterminate an entire island's population. Not because of any strategic importance, but only because of the fear of what other people would think if they didn't do it. And yet, that's just what they did. Thucydides doesn't read this as revealing some dark stain in the Athenian soul or revealing some sort of absolute brutality at the heart of all humans that's finally unleashed in situations of war. That's not his point. His point is that people in certain contexts will behave in certain ways. Character has little to do with it. But the necessity of context seems, over time, to outweigh the noble sentiments of moral character. In a way, this is the grimmest sort of fatalism. This is the fatalism you might see in a foot soldier in a war, who sees only random death and persistent, soul-drubbing cruelty. Those who are best are rendered more vulnerable by their virtues, or put in more danger by their courage. And so they die or are maimed more quickly in combat. In war, it is the cowardly and the cunning who stand the best chance of surviving. Thucydides himself knew this because he was a general in the Peloponnesian War. He fought in various engagements and finally was exiled from Athens for his inability finally to lift a siege of a crucial outpost before the outpost surrendered. Thucydides, in telling the story of that event, doesn't make it a large part of the war. He makes it a very passing mention in his book, and he talks about himself in the third person. Thucydides the Athenian was sent out to do this. He traveled as quickly as he could. It was winter and cold, but his ships did not get there in time, and after that he was exiled. It's an astonishing revelation that if you don't look for it in the book, you won't realize is there, because the book is so clearly not the kind of book that politicians or generals today write, which is mostly about justifying themselves. Thucydides was actually interested in trying to tell the story of this war. For him, for the Greek tragedians, the key here, when it comes to thinking about evil, is that there is no simple or straightforward moral order. All of our moral actions are subject to dramatic reversal, deformation, and there are no guarantees that the human's moral sincerity will not, in fact, turn out to be destructive, perhaps even self-destructive. Furthermore, Thucydides, I think, introduces into Western consciousness the idea of the accident, the possibility, that is, that evil and suffering, whenever they happen, may well have no cause at all, at least no cause that we can recognize as an intentional, purposeful act, whether of a human being or of some callous divinity off in some paradise somewhere. Thucydides and the Greek tragedians are only two of the voices that the Greek world offers us. In our next lecture, we'll look at a rival view to both of them in Greek thought, that of the philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who came after the tragedians and Thucydides, and those inspired by these philosophers, who argue that the myths and the tragedies significantly misunderstood the nature of our situation and the nature of our cosmos.